Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. Great to see all of you here this morning to talk about, as Declan said, I think a very complex and difficult topic, but a very, very important one in all of our societies today. As Dorothy mentioned, I'm Scott Griffen. I'm representing the International Press Institute, which is a global media freedom organization based in Vienna. And it's actually an association, it's the membership association of editors, publishers, and journalists from around the world. It was founded in 1950, actually, by a group of editors who believed that media freedom could be a tool to promote peace. And in its history, it's had sort of the main mandate of protecting journalistic freedom, but sort of a complementary mandate of promoting good journalism, good independent journalism, and obviously a part of that is practicing ethical reporting and avoiding things like hate speech. But again, this is a really complicated issue, in particular for freedom of expression defenders, because certainly, laws against hate speech are a way of restricting speech in a way that we do agree with, of course. But in our view, it's really important to try to find the right balance between freedom of expression on the one hand and a set of rights on the other that are threatened by hate speech. And that's sort of what I wanted to just discuss in these 20 minutes this morning, is sort of hate speech in the context of freedom of expression. And as I've already mentioned, we sort of look here at a balance between two rights or sets of rights. On the one hand, you have free expression, which includes the right to transmit and receive information, including information that may shock, offend, or disturb us, both because there's this public aspect of free expression that's, in terms of the media's role in democratic society, and there's also a private aspect in terms of the role that free expression plays in our own self-development and self-determination. So this is on the one side. On the other side, you have a number of rights that can be threatened by hate speech. If you think about the speech itself, the act itself, you have something like a right to dignity, which can be so the way that one feels when one is confronted with hateful remarks. But then you have the rights that are affected by the consequences of hate speech, the right to non-discrimination, right to bodily integrity, or even the right to life if we're talking about speech that really incites serious forms of violence. I don't know if this sounds easy, but certainly it's not easy in practice to find where this balance lies, and there are a number of reasons for that. And one is certainly that there's a problem in defining what hate speech actually is. And I'm sure if I asked everyone in this room to define hate speech, I would probably get, a different answer from each person. And that's because in many ways it can be quite a subjective concept, and might reflect the way sort of, our own personal backgrounds, our own personal beliefs. But in a general level, we can say that there is a legal definition of hate speech. If you look at international law, which I'm not going to go into this morning, but generally hate speech in the law is speech that incites or that can incite hatred, discrimination, or violence. But in addition to this legal definition, obviously we have other kinds of definitions, moral and ethical definitions, so that it's the kind of speech that we see or that we perceive as being hateful, or as being sort of driven by intolerance of others. And this kind of speech, which I think is certainly part of what this project is trying to address, may or may not rise to the level of illegal hate speech. And that's sort of an important distinction to understand, that not everything that we perceive as being hateful is actually something that could be, for example, lead to a criminal conviction or something like this. We also have a problem in terms of whom hate speech laws are intended to protect. If you look at, in terms of international law, the first documents talked about sort of this very classical types of group identity like race and ethnicity and national origin. And this is a list that has really expanded over time. So now we have, we also include things like disability or gender, sexual orientation, veteran status, and in some countries this list gets quite long. So we also see things like political ideology or political party affiliation or even trade union affiliation. So it can get quite long, and it's not always clear where this list should stop and what should the sort of baseline be. How do we determine which groups of people should be protected under hate speech law? So this is something that's still very much debated today. And this leads to a separate distinction that we have to make between protecting people versus protecting ideas. And this is something that's that I would say is becoming more and more of an issue when we look at, in particular, religion. These hate speech laws ought to, at least from our perspective, they ought to protect people. So, for example, they ought to protect people from being attacked based on the religion that they belong to, but they shouldn't protect, for example, the ideas or belief systems behind a religion, because these sorts of things we think need to be able to be debated in a society, and at least because religion still has a profound effect on states and the policies that states set. So this is a distinction that can be difficult to make, because certainly many attacks on religious belief systems may be driven by hate and intolerance. But we still have to be very careful, and that's why, for example, my organization, we oppose blasphemy laws, which still exist in Ireland, for example. But we sort of feel that these laws protect not the people, but the belief systems behind certain religions. And I think I should mention too that hate speech. This is sort of a theme of the first half of my remarks. There's not necessarily a clear definition when we look internationally. And so perhaps many of you know, for example, in the United States, the bar for hate speech is much, much higher. That is to say that the sphere, the potential for making hateful comments is much greater. The famous example is from a Supreme Court case in the 1960s when the Ku Klux Klan marched through a town burning crosses and shouting all sorts of racist and bigoted remarks. And eventually the Supreme Court said that their speech was actually protected because it didn't constitute what's called imminent, potential for imminent lawless violence. And that standard is very different from what we have in Europe. The standard doesn't include this need to be imminent. So under European law, speech that simply incites violence, for example, can be considered hate speech, but that's not the case in the United States, for example. And we also have different standards if you look more to the Islamic world, where things like blasphemy tend to be seen as hate speech, whereas in Europe, we don't. We try to make that distinction. And with all this in mind, with keeping in mind the difficulty of defining hate speech, certainly there is also a potential for the concept of hate speech to be overused or to be misused in society. For example, we're all talking a lot right now about the fake news debate and the way that we see there's a lot of well-meaning initiatives by governments to counter fake news, but we also see on the other side that many of these governments, for example, now turn to the term fake news when they want to respond to, or when they want to discredit content that they don't like, and to a certain extent there's also this danger with hate speech because it's so difficult to define. And for example, we had a case, my organization IPI is very much involved in Turkey, where there's really a terrible situation regarding press freedom, which, by the way, you should support any campaigns supporting press freedom in Turkey, because it's a really awful situation. But for example, last year 2 journalists from a secular newspaper called Cumhuriyet reprinted images from the first issue of Charlie Hebdo that came out after the attacks there, and they wanted to show solidarity with Charlie Hebdo, and eventually they were convicted and sentenced to prison for promoting hate against religious groups to the media. So this is an example that shows that we do have to be careful in the way that we define hate speech, and that courts need to be careful in the way that they interpret these concepts, because in places where freedom of expression is not as well protected, there can be serious consequences. As I said, I'm not going to go into the legal aspects of hate speech, but I want to turn now just briefly for the rest of the time into the challenges that come with hate speech online. And it is certainly true that hate speech online brings with it an entirely new set of challenges. So beyond all the ones that I've mentioned already, we have just obviously probably a much greater amount of hate, as I'm sure we all recognize and we have to deal with in our work. But I would say that one of the biggest problems, one of the central problems of hate speech online is the problems that authorities have in terms of holding people accountable. And one of the messages that I would like to sort of deliver is that we already have hate speech, we already have laws against hate speech, so we don't need new laws, but we do need the authorities to actually ensure that these laws are properly carried out. And this is a significant issue, and what we see is that these laws are not being carried out. So we know this. This is obvious. You go online to social media, you see that there's a ton of hateful remarks out there that do rise to this level of illegal hate speech, and that nothing is being done about them. So we do see that. And there are a number of reasons, I don't know if I would call them reasons, because in fact state authorities should be upholding these laws, but there are a number of reasons that this becomes more difficult. Some of these are quite obvious. Think, for example, the principle of what's called territoriality. So normally a state's laws apply to that state, but when we talk about hate speech online, we're talking about content that travels very easily across borders. Anything that's said online here in Ireland can easily be read or seen in other parts of the world, and it can be very difficult for police to find out who is behind those comments and to hold those people accountable. And we have a very similar problem when it comes to anonymity. Again, the online space is full of people who are online anonymously, and this creates a certain tension, I must say, for freedom of expression, because anonymity is something that we view as free expression defenders as a very important tool for people to be able to express themselves online in many places, in particular where individuals could face consequences for disseminating certain opinions. And it's very important to have that anonymity, but at the same time, this anonymity is precisely one of the elements that is making it very difficult for people who do commit hate speech online to be held accountable. And we do know that, for example, social networks are not always forthcoming with the authorities in terms of finding out who is behind anonymous accounts. And then I would mention also that there is a big debate about who actually is responsible for hate speech online. That is to say, for example, is it internet service providers? So if you use a particular internet service, or if you use a particular social media service, there are some who would argue that those service providers ought to be held liable, both criminally and civilly, for the comments that users post. And that is a question that again creates a certain tension for freedom of expression, because these service providers and social media networks have a very important role to play everywhere, really, in giving people a chance to express themselves and debate topics and disseminate opinions. And if we start holding them liable, this can create a certain censoring effect, which I will mention in just a minute. But this is also something that's very much debated. Who is actually responsible? Is it individuals who commit hate speech, or is it the platforms that they use? And it's something that hasn't been solved yet. So I would say that there's a big problem in terms of enforcing the law, and we don't know against whom it should be enforced. And then I really want to focus just in the last few minutes on something that is coming up, and this is related to what I was just mentioning, but it's the role of private corporations such as Facebook and Twitter when it comes to policing hate speech. And you probably know that these companies are coming under a great deal of pressure from governments to do something about hate speech. We see it every day, and it can be very frustrating when these companies don't remove content that is so obviously in breach of hate speech laws. And actually, just last week, the German government approved a very interesting proposal that will fine Facebook, Twitter, and other social media companies up to 50 million euros when they do not remove content that is obviously illegal and has been reported to them from their users. And at first glance, this seems to be, I just want to say a few things about this because this is an issue that's going to be coming up more and more in Europe. And just a few comments about this. It raises a number of questions, one of which is how comfortable we are in turning over the role of deciding what is and what is not hate speech, what is and what is not allowable content to private corporations. Essentially, in this case, instead of a court deciding whether or not you've committed a crime, these companies would be deciding whether or not to erase this content based on their understanding of what the law is. And this is sort of a departure if we think about the principle, the rule of law, and many persons, many groups that defend free expression have really come out against this proposal because they're concerned that these companies will over-censor, will start to over-regulate. I don't know if any of you saw, for example, there was a couple months ago, there was a big controversy after Facebook deleted a very famous photo from the Vietnam War that had been posted by a Norwegian newspaper. And this photo, they said, was child pornography, even though this was one of the most famous images from the war and obviously played a key role in terms of building public opinion about the war. So this shows that these kind of companies don't always know actually what is best when it comes to free expression. So there's this problem of potentially censorship on social media companies. And there's also the question, I would say, again, coming back to the need for police and state authorities to hold people who commit hate speech accountable. In this case, social media companies would simply be deleting content, but it's not clear that people actually who write sort of these hateful expressions would actually be held accountable. And in my view, what we really need is for laws to be enforced. So if people need to understand that committing hate speech online is the same thing as committing hate speech out on the street. And if it's just a question of Facebook and Twitter deleting comments, I'm not sure that people will actually understand that when they make certain kinds of remarks, they in fact are committing a crime. So some voices have come out and said, the emphasis should not be on outsourcing this activity to social media companies, but actually it's up to law enforcement authorities to find out who wrote these comments and hold them accountable, ultimately. And perhaps also one might want to consider the economic interests that internet service providers and social media companies like Facebook and Twitter have. If you look at, we can look at a number of countries. For example, if you look at Austria, where IPI is based, if you take a look at Facebook and you see who are the most popular Facebook users, well, in fact, if you look at politicians, most of the most popular politicians are extreme right-wing politicians who have hundreds of thousands of followers on Facebook, and they do a very good job of provoking hate speech in terms of, they know which kind of posts will provoke a flood of commentary on Facebook. They attack journalists. They attack the right journalists, let's say. They know what their users want. And of course, it would be very difficult, I think, for these kind of companies to suddenly take a very hard line because their platforms are very popular with a certain segment of the public. And the same thing in Twitter. We've had a very big problem in Turkey, for example. Twitter there is the main platform for political debate, and we have IPI has been working to combat online attacks against journalists, which isn't the same thing as hate speech, but there are many parallels in terms of the way journalists there are threatened with death and maligned based on not only that they are journalists, but that they belong to certain groups, minority groups, or because of their gender. And we see that Twitter has done really a terrible job of ensuring that these comments are deleted and followed up on. And a cynic might say, well, Twitter has so many users in Turkey and so many people are engaged in this kind of speech. Certainly they're going to want to be careful in terms of the way they react. So there are many things to consider there. And finally, and with this I'll close, another thing that, another element of the hate speech debate that is critical is media coverage of hate speech. And what I mean by that is, I read often, articles saying, there's this one crazy politician who said this sort of incredible thing about minorities, some hateful comment, and it becomes, this front page news story. And we really have to think as media practitioners how much attention we give to people who are engaging in hate speech. Because in the end, although it certainly is important to know what our elected officials are saying, we don't need to know what every single one of them is saying all the time, in particular if they have a very limited impact. And so I think that we have to be very careful about giving a platform through the media to people who are engaging in hate speech, because in the end, this may help to give legitimacy to particular political actors who may have always been there. They're always fringe. They're always going to be fringe persons in politics. But sort of this media attention of sort of making a spectacle out of every single hateful comment that is made, again, perhaps gives legitimacy to persons who deserve it or who otherwise would not have it. So I think I've used up my 20 minutes, but I hope that I've just touched on a number of different issues that are important to keep in mind when talking about hate speech, which again I say it's a really complicated issue, but it's one of the most important issues that we are facing now. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.